what he does is he interprets people's stories into pictures. And he has a project right now that he's doing where he works with Indigenous cancer patients. Here's their story, makes a picture, and then that picture is made into a quilt, which they can take with them to Kibo. So I just like to put a plug in for him because he's an amazing young artist. Alrighty, so we're gonna do a lot of things today. I'm gonna give you a whole bunch of information. You're probably not gonna retain it all. I have made my slides available for sharing because there's tons of resources with links in there. For if it's important to you, you might want to pull that slide off and have the links. I just recently became a full-time professor in the Department of Family Medicine, but before that I had regional lead roles for palliative care and Indigenous health, as well as an Indigenous health consultant. So today we're going to explore the principle of 2IC, introduce the social determinants of health for Indigenous people, and apply that to a case that occurred here at Brantford General about 2 years ago. So why do we do this kind of teaching, and why does it matter at all? Well, in healthcare, a lot of us really took a focused approach on doing this kind of teaching after the case of Ryan Sinclair in Winnipeg. So he was an Indigenous man who was wheelchair-bound, double amputee, had a neurogenic bladder, and had an indwelling catheter. He goes to the community health center, sees the family doctor. They said, "We can't fix this here. You need to go to the ER." She writes a note and tucks it into his pocket. He goes to the ER. He sees a triage nurse, and the next 24 hours are on videotape, where he becomes sicker and sicker and sicker, even vomiting. And finally, when the nurse goes to check on him 34 hours later, he's dead, and rigor mortis has already set in. And his cousin, during the inquest, said honestly they thought he was just a street person sleeping it off. They thought he was just another drunken Indian coming to pass out. So that kind of galvanized the Indigenous health professionals across Canada, saying we need to be doing more of this teaching. And lest we think that we would never do what Winnipeg did, I'm including a case not as dramatic as this, but one that did cause trauma to the patient and the family, because I think sometimes we just don't know what we don't know, and we traumatize people because of that. So this was an 82-year-old female who was in relatively great shape, well-controlled diabetes, just on diet, hypertension, one pill, great physical condition, really active. She was walking up cement steps that had no hand railing, fell backwards, hit her head, multiple skull fractures and intracranial hemorrhage. I met the ambulance pulling in. I just happened to be here, and her daughter jumped, come running across the street, told me what happened. So I went in, spoke to the ER doctor, helped the family to sort of settle, and basically we said we don't know. We kind of just got to sit on this one and wait because we don't know if she's going to survive. In the middle of the night, I get a call from the daughter. And while you're wondering why a doctor would get a call from a family member, when you're an Indigenous physician in your own community, people come to your door at 3 o'clock in the morning, Saturdays, they call your mother, they can't get you, so answer the phone. So basically the daughter said, they're torturing my mother. If you don't get her out of here, I'm going to take her out. So I said, okay. I got up and I came in. When I got here at the nurses' station, wonderful nurses. I work with these nurses all the time. They're great nurses. But they're upset. They're like, it's so loud down there. There's a whole bunch of people down there. This isn't the way it should be. Everybody wants to be involved in the decisions. They're not letting us do the work we need to do for this patient. I said, okay, let me go down there and see what's happening. When I go down there, patient is in restraints, very agitated, and she's speaking her native language. I've never heard this woman speak her native language, and I've known her a very long time. So I said to the kids, because some of the older ones could speak the language, I said, what is she saying? Basically, she was 5 years old in residential school, being held down and being abused. That's what she was experiencing in her delirium, in restraints in the hospital. So I talked to the family about what was going on, and one of their other complaints was they had talked to several healthcare members, and they were like, they just want her to die. They just want her to stop being a full coat. This is our mother. We're going to do whatever we can for her. And they keep telling us we're being unrealistic. And the other one was that they had been asked at least 8 times. This way, she hadn't even been here 12 hours. about how much alcohol their mother consumed. The woman did not consume alcohol at all. So they were very upset, and this is why they wanted to take the patient out. Okay, we're going to come back to the case, but now I'm going to explain what two-eyed seeing is. So it's actually a Mi'kmaq concept, and it was part of the Institute of Integrative Science and Health at Cape Breton in 2004. And although that institute is no longer at Cape Breton, all of the information is still available. Basically, we as healthcare professionals are trained in a Western model of care. And we have to be knowledgeable in that. But where we're not good at is stepping outside of that and seeing the value in other ways of knowing and seeing and gaining knowledge. So all of this concept is saying is that we take the best of both. We take the best of the Western world, we take the best of the Indigenous world, and when we put them together, we've got a bigger, clearer picture. And it's actually a gift. And this is just a pictorial example of that. So when I started back to university, I was 25 years old. And this is how I understood the world. I understood it through nature. Not because we were really traditional, but that's how my family had taught us stuff. So I'll give you, for example, my dad has a grade 8 education. He's the smartest man I know. But he only went to grade 8. And he self-taught himself all kinds of things. But I can remember being 8 years old, and he took me outside, and it was a sunny day, but there had just been a rain shower. And he said, look at the bottom of the fence, and look at that raindrop hanging on the bottom of the fence. So I stood there and looked at it. The raindrop never dropped. He said, when the raindrops don't drop, it means it'll rain again today. And I filed that in my mind and thought, okay, yeah, whatever. So fast forward like 20 years, and I'm in university learning about the scientific principles of atmospheric pressure and surface tension of water, and all those things came together to keep that raindrop on that fence. So my dad, people would say, is an uneducated man, but he understood that principle. He just described it in a different way. So oftentimes we look at people from other cultures or other ways of knowing that they are more basic or they don't really understand what's going on. It's not always the case. The case actually may be that they understand it in a very different way than our scientific principles. And that's what I wanted to illustrate with these pictures. So I want you to take a minute and just look at these two pictures and think about what you see in those pictures. Now, no cheating for some of those who know what these pictures are. But when we look at these pictures, we see lots of things. We see beautiful art, we see talent, we see nature, we see a depiction of previous Indigenous people. But what many of you will not see is the governance system, the community organization of both the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe wrapped up in those two pictures. Their entire governance system is in that picture. But because you don't understand it the way we understand it, you don't see it that way. So it's an example of two-eyed seeing. If you just looked at that with one eye, the Western eye, you see it as beautiful art. If you look at it with both eyes, you see the beautiful art and the meaning behind it. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about worldviews because it's important to what we're talking about today. Everybody has a worldview. A lot of it is shaped by the community that you're in, and then all of the experiences that as an individual you have, it shapes your worldview. And that's important because races and nations have worldviews, and the individuals in between there may have different worldviews. So I'll give you for instance. So on 6 nations, roughly a third of people are only believe in the traditional spiritual system. Roughly a third of people believe in Christianity, and the last third believe in both. So although we have a shared worldview about who we are as Indigenous people, each one of us are individual and how our own individual worldview is played out in our lives. And oftentimes when we think about culture, we only think about the things we see. The music, the dancing, the regalia, the food, powwows. But when we're talking about culture, anybody's culture, It's the stuff under the water that's most important. How do they understand health and disease and death? How do they understand relationships? All of those pieces that are much, much deeper that we never look at, those are actually more important cultural pieces than all of the stuff that we can see. So why is that important? Well, when all of this relates back to the first time that Europeans came to North America. And people will ask, well, was it always all that bad? No, it wasn't always all that bad. People really did try in the beginning to find mutual understanding, for the most part. They tried to, build a trade system. That's how the fur trade and Hudson's Bay Company came along, was through those collaborations between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people. People intermarried, there was friendships, things going on. People did try. It wasn't all just war and fighting. But we tended to have different worldviews. Now this was the agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Dutch. That's initially what the agreement was, but that's been extended to other nations now. But this was from 1613, and we didn't have written language. So our contracts, if you will, or treaties, were put into wampum belts. So everything in a wampum belt is made from something living. The string, the beads, the leather, everything is from living. And the reason for that is that is a living document forever. So my people still believe this is a living document. This is a living treaty with my people and all the nations that have come to Turtle Island, North America. And the idea is that it's a river, and the waters of the river are illustrated in white. They're peace, respect, and friendship. So we're going to have a relationship based on peace, respect, and friendship. We're going to treat each other like brothers. The two purple lines represent vessels. One is a European ship, and it has everything that European people need in it. Their medicine, their knowledge, their skills, their families, everything is in there. The other is a canoe, and it has everything that Indigenous people need in there. And we're going to go down the water of life together, side by side. We'll help each other when we can, but nobody needs to jump in the other boat and take over. Now, that's not what happened, but this is what we still believe can happen. We believe we can go back to this relationship, and that's really what we want to do. And we want to do it as brothers. It's not a system of hierarchy. It's a system of being side by side. So while what happened, there was a clash of worldviews. This is by a Chief Justice of the U.S. And there was a thought. If you go back and you look at when North America was colonized, they'll say it was terra nullius, which means nobody's on this land. This map indicates the location of all the Indigenous nations that were on North America when Columbus first came here. So it wasn't void. It wasn't an empty land. And that's where the clash of worldviews came, because then the fight became over the land. So in Canada, really there's been policy making around Indigenous people since 1763. The first was the Royal Proclamation, and this was done with good intention. They realized that there was a high risk for Indigenous people to be taken advantage of and their land be taken away from them. So the Crown said, okay, we're going to say that only the Indigenous people can only make those deals with the Crown, not with anybody else, so that they can't be taken advantage of. Unfortunately, as you go from 1857 onward, the intention wasn't good anymore. It was about assimilation. It was about taking the savage and making them a proper Canadian, civilizing us. And it became more and more and more restricted as we went, until we get to the Indian Act. So when we think about, when I was doing the cancer care leave, people would always ask me, well, why don't your people show up early? Like they're not getting screened, they're showing up late stage cancers. Why is this going on? Well, to answer that question, we have to go all the way back to where the disease started, and that was the clash of worldviews. And really, the Indian Act is a good example of how that all came to be. So when the Indian Act came to be in 1867, it basically said the Crown had power over everything about Indigenous people. So it othered us in Canada. And when you other somebody, you introduce racism and social exclusion. And when you introduce that, you impact people's self-esteem. And of course, that Indian Act took away all the self-determination that Indigenous people had. They were no longer able to make decisions for themselves. The Indian Act has been amended over several years, initially being more restrictive. So for instance, the first Indigenous nurse from Six Nations, Edith Montour, could not get trained in Canada because they would not train an Indigenous woman unless she said, I will give up all of my rights as an Indigenous person. So she had to go to the US and be trained by the military. The first Indigenous doctor in Canada actually came from New Credit, or from Credit. And the only reason he got to be a doctor is he got into medical school just before that rule was made that you had to give up all your rights to go to university. So you had to give up all your rights to go to university, you had to give up all your rights to vote, you had to give up all your rights to be in the army. So we have lots and lots of Indigenous veterans who went and fought for Canada, knowing they had to give up their rights to do that. And then after around 1948, those amendments started to relax. So around 1960, things had really relaxed a lot. But prior to that, women who married outside of their own communities lost their status. They were no longer considered Indigenous by the federal government. So there was a whole generation of people out there who were Indigenous, but the federal government said, no, you're not. And the Indian Act is the only legislation federally in our country that has restrictions or guides the life of an ethnicity or a race. There's no Muslim Act, there's no LGBTQ Act, there's none of that. We're the only population that has an act specifically to say what is to be done with us. And it's still enforced today, and it's still called the Indian Act. And when you ask the federal government why it's still the Indian Act, they say, well, you know, there's been so much policy and legislation going forward using the term Indian that if we change the Indian Act, we change everything. So there's no progress made on that at all. And the only reason that I bring up the Indian Act kind of thing is because when I went to university, I was of the generation where we still called ourselves Indians. We just did it. And I was sitting in a small group learning, and there was a woman from India in my group. I didn't even think anything of it, and I'm talking about Indians, and she looks at me and she says, you're not Indian. And I thought, oh, geez, I'm not, I guess. So you'll hear people still call themselves Indians because a lot of us grew up like that. I'm not going to go through all this because we've kind of talked about that, but our lands, even though we made treaties, even though there were deeds, all of that, it didn't really matter because people could still do what they want. They could still take on land, they could still sell it, they could still send us away, even if they put us on a reserve and the community beside us was growing and that community wanted our land, they just pick us up and move us away. So when you think about all those communities up north that don't have access to anything, they didn't choose to go up north and be on terrible land where they couldn't survive. They were put there. And now they're isolated up there and nobody pays attention because they're the other. But I want to bring your attention to the picture actually because it was called the pass system and most people don't know about that. And this one really gets me because it was a gentleman who lived on a reserve, and to leave your reserve, you had to get permission. So he had to go to the federal agent, the Indian agent, and say, I want permission to leave my reserve to go to another community to see my kids that you put in residential school. So that's how tightly everything was controlled around Indigenous people. It has relaxed some, but still, most of our lives is controlled by the Indian Act. Now, this is the Mohawk Institute, our residential school right here in Brantford, and it was the very first one opening in 1831. It's not the original building, it was burnt down twice before that, but it still stands. And people will say, well, you know, other countries had that. Residential schools were like a virus. The US started them, industrial schools, to civilize the American Indian. Basically, it was to teach them to be domestic servants and farmers. They weren't learning to be educated people. Canada went over there and said, oh, I like what you're doing over here, brought it here. South Africa then came here, said the same thing and took it back, and it was a part of apartheid. So it was like a virus, it spread through nations. And people will say, well, if it was so bad, why didn't anybody do anything about it? Well, the federal government itself actually sent out a doctor in 1907, and he went around and visited, and he said, this is a national crime, we should not be doing this. And the federal government took that report and put it on a shelf. And 13 years later, they said, well, it's working so good, we're gonna make it compulsory. And then it just, I mean, we know the legacy of it, but by the 1950s, the federal government was like, we don't really want to do this anymore. Let's shift the responsibility down to the provinces. The provinces didn't want to run schools like this either, so eventually they were phased out into day schools, where all the same rules still applied, but you didn't have to spend a night, you could actually go home. And then eventually the last residential school closed in 1996. So this is an ancient history. We have patients here all the time who have been in residential school, or the parents have been in residential school. And there's always lots of controversy around, in the papers around statues, buildings being named after, great Canadians. And people always ask me what I think of that. Well, I don't give an opinion. I don't give an opinion on Sir John A. Macdonald. But what I do is point out this quote. When the school is on the reserve, the child lives with its parents who are savages. He is surrounded by savages, and though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training and mode of thought are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write. It's been a strong press on myself as the head of the department that Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from the parental influence, and the only way to do that would be to put them in central training industrial schools, where they will all acquire the habits and modes and thoughts of white men. So when Canada talks about Sir John A. Macdonald, they remember him very differently than Indigenous people do. This is how we remember him. This is how we remember a lot of Canadian leaders. And we've heard a lot about the trauma of residential schools, the legacy of abuse, the physical, sexual, and emotional, psychological abuse. But what we haven't always heard about is the loss of identity. So there are stories of children coming who only spoke their language, and maybe they were 4 or 5. They were put into residential school, and they had been there for 10, 11 years. When they went home, they no longer knew their culture, and they no longer knew their language. They were strangers in their own homes, with their own families and their own communities. And because they didn't know who they were, that impacted generations going forward. Also, families were broken up. So some people say, well, not everybody got abused in residential school. I want you to imagine, for those of you who have children or nieces or nephews, that somebody knocks on the door and takes the 4-year-old child out of your home and says, you can maybe see them at Christmas. The rest of the time they're going to be with us, and we're going to tell them what to do. There's a story of, at the residential school, there was a water pipe in the basement in the boys' playroom. And the little boys, when they would get sad or crying or whatever, the big boys would put them on top of the soccer field and tell them to hug that water pipe, close their eyes, and pretend it's your mom, because it's warm and it's comforting. So, to me, any child that grows up without love, that grows up without being able to have somebody to kiss them goodnight and tell them they love them and they're special, that is abuse. And because of residential schools, because of loss of parenting skills, loss of identity, and people not being educated to be lawyers and doctors and nurses, you end up with significant educational, health, and income disparities. And it ingrained racism even further. We were othered. We had a whole separate education system, and it was federal policy. So it ingrained, it's okay to treat them like the other. They're not the same as us. They're not civilized like us. We lost a lot of languages. I don't speak my language. Many people on Six Nations don't speak their language. There was more children in the child welfare system and more children in prison and being victimized. All as a direct result of residential school. And that's if you survived residential school, because your chance of dying in residential school was very high. And that didn't end. So when residential school became less compulsory and we were moving to day schools, there was still a way to get the children. It was called the 60 scoop. And that's when the children's aid system just went in there and scooped children out of their homes. Scooped them sometimes right out of residential school into foster homes. And all those people experienced almost all the same things that people did at residential school. Loss of identity, not knowing who they are, This is a picture by a survivor, and what she's depicting there is all the foster homes that she was in and out when all she really wanted to do was go home. And this what happened between the 50s and the 80s. So we're dealing with those people today in our healthcare system. And I put this in because when I kept hearing that there was, we need to increase Indigenous people in post-secondary school. And I thought, well, why aren't we there? Well, because of the Indian Act. We weren't allowed to be there for a long, long time. As in 1978, there was only 2,600 across Canada in post-secondary education. And that just shows when the law changed. Now there's exponentially more, but we're nowhere near the level of other populations. In 1982, when I was 8, that's when Canada reopened the Constitution and said we had rights. Until that point, we were considered wards of the crown, that we did not have the cognitive ability to make decisions for ourselves. That's not ancient history. And then in 1983, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms was added. However, it wasn't until 2011 that an Indigenous person could make a full complaint to the Human Rights Commission, because that's when all of the legislation was finally changed properly, that we could make a human rights complaint. So up until 8 years ago, I could not make a human rights complaint in this country because I was an Indigenous person. That's not ancient history. So we ended up with systems built without knowledge of us, without understanding of us, and ingrained by federal policy, provincial policy, and legislation that said it's okay to other them. And that affected our healthcare systems, our education systems, our community systems, how we treat and think about the environment, and again, back to self-determination. I always put this picture up here because there's some people who's never seen this status card. This is a current status card, and you can see at the top it says Certificate of Indian Status. The federal government still decides who gets status, who's an Indian, and we all get a number. And people will often say, yeah, but you get everything paid for. I'm going to give you an example, and I'm going to use myself. So when I went to medical school, or when I went back to school, I was poor. I lived on $17,000 in 2001, and I had 3 children. And I worked part-time, I went to school full-time, and I did everything I could to put food on the table for my kids. When I got to medical school, there was no way for me to work part-time. And I thought, well, how am I going to live? Because my band only gives me $800, and that's not going to be enough for me and 3 kids. They do pay my tuition. So, well, when you walked into medical school, the banks are sitting there saying, here, have a loan. And they don't ask too many questions because they think we're all going to be rich anyways afterwards, and they're not worried about getting their money back. So I took a loan. I took a student loan of $150,000. And that sustained me through residency and through medical school. And I lived okay, and my kids lived okay. What I didn't know, because I never had a loan, because I live on reserve, was that the expectation was, basically the day after residency, I would take that loan and convert it into a personal line of credit. Well, when I went to the bank, they said no. I live on reserve, I own a house, it's paid for, but it means nothing because a bank cannot come on Crown land and foreclose. So my house, all of my assets are on reserve, they mean nothing. So here I am 6 years later, I am a physician who cannot get a bank loan because I'm Indigenous and I live on reserve. So yes, we do get some good things. I ain't gonna lie, the tax off of your gas there's nothing bad about that. But we pay for it in a lot of other ways that people don't understand. A lot of people do not know that there was a whole separate hospital system for Indigenous people that ran from the 1920s to the 1980s. And this wasn't to give us culturally competent care. It was to keep us away from everybody else. There was no tuberculosis in North America before contact. It wasn't one of the native diseases in this land. But when we had contact and when we were marginalized and when we were put onto reserves and we began to live a poverty type of life, TB can run rampant in that condition, right? So somehow, because it ran rampant in our communities, it became Indian tuberculosis. So they built a hospital system to keep Canada away from Indian tuberculosis. And these were not where the best doctors went and the best nurses. It was underfunded, under-resourced, and a lot of things went on that shouldn't have went on. If you ever get a chance to read Maureen Lux's work out of Brock University, she's done a whole study on this. But I'll give you for example, there were lots of research and medical experiments that went on, no consent, no, they weren't asked, it just happened. There was lobectomies for tuberculosis going on long after we knew medications could cure or control TB. There's a story of Lady Wellington, it was our Indian Reserve on Six Nations, of a young woman coming in with appendicitis. Otherwise should have been a routine surgery, was the appendicitis or the appendix had not burst, but they did not have anybody trained in anesthesia. So they just picked somebody and said, here, you can do this, a doctor without the training. That woman died. In the report back to the ministry, the doctor kind of made light of the fact that she died, and good thing nobody really knows. And that report exists. It's in the archives of the Ministry of Health. So those are the things that went on in Indian hospitals. And while non-Indigenous people may not know about this, Indigenous people know about this. These stories are told to us. I knew about all of this stuff, maybe not in this level of detail, but I knew about all this stuff by the time I was 10 years old. So even though it's not taught in the schools regularly, even though we may not know it as mainstream Canadians, Indigenous people know this. And then I went to McMaster, the home of evidence-based medicine. This is just for you, Dr. Bates. And I started hearing of every time we talked about a respirology topic, First Nations was a risk factor, particularly for tuberculosis. So then I thought, well, am I genetically at risk? And then that's when I found out I wasn't. And then I found out that the Federal Public Health Agency was sending $3 million to Hamilton as late as like 2009 for tuberculosis on Six Nations. There's not been an active case of tuberculosis on Six Nations in 30 years. So this has gotten so ingrained into our evidence base that now people are taught and they actually think that being First Nations is a risk factor. No, it's the social conditions you live in that make you high risk for tuberculosis. And the other thing is geographic variation. So again, look at the map. This is a tuberculosis incidence map. Here in Southern Ontario, we don't have any greater incidence than the general Canadian rate. It's up in the north where they're living in different housing conditions and just different social conditions where it's higher. So if you do a study on us on Six Nations, you can't generalize that up to the north. Every community is going to be different. There's also a low participation rate. As I said, there were all kinds of experiments that went on for in residential school and in the Indian hospitals. Testing around TB went on children in Quebec. With no consent, families didn't even know. So people do not trust research. And as I said, they're not comparable across studies. First of all, you have the federal government who has a very different relationship with you based on whether you're First Nations, Métis, or Inuit. And if you're First Nations, it's a very different relationship whether you're status or non-status. So there we have lots of people that are First Nations and don't have their status because the federal government hasn't given them their status for whatever reason. And they don't have access to any of those things that I have access to, like tuition support or a gas card for taxing. So you can't compare any of those populations together. And then again, it's not consistent with worldviews. This is the scientific method that was made in a different worldview. It's not our worldview. We still have children caught up in the welfare system. Now, Six Nations has recently begun the journey to take up their own child welfare system, and there's going to be a lot of hiccups and bumps along the way with that. But right now, there are more children in care in Canada than ever went to residential school. So this is still going on in different ways, in different forms. And our policy and our legislation embeds it. It's based on the idea still that Indigenous people cannot determine for themselves. And basically, our systems are failing our Indigenous people. These are all headlines from this year. So the missing and murdered Indigenous women. You know, most of the controversy has been over the word genocide. Why isn't the controversy over the fact that there are missing and murdered Indigenous women? And then people say, well, yeah, but it's mostly domestic violence. Okay. Well, the Indian Act and all the things that followed that changed how our Indigenous men see our women. Our community was matriarchal. Our women held a esteemed place of power in our community. The Indian Act changed all that because it said, no, the man's the head of the home. So it changed all of that, all down the line, and now we've got to steer that ship back. As I said, there's still way too many of our kids in the child welfare system. Forced sterilization, people say, is that really still happening? Well, people do not get good informed consent all the time. And I'm one of them. When I was 23 years old, I had my third child. And I was young. I hadn't considered stopping having children, but my obstetrician, he's since died, he didn't give me an option. He said, you've had 3 children, you're 23 years old, you're getting a tubal ligation. Okay. I was uneducated. I didn't feel I had any power to fight back. I showed up, I had my tubal ligation. And my life changed forever at 23. So yeah, it still goes on in different forms. And then there, as I said, the remote communities. I keep saying, that they deserve primary care too, and they deserve better care. And what I hear from healthcare leaders is, oh, nobody wants to go out there. Well, why is that acceptable? We go to Africa, we go to South America. Why is it acceptable that nobody wants to go north? Those folks deserve to have care just like everyone else. So then we get to the proximal determinants of health, and these are the ones we hear about all the time. People are poor, they're homeless, or they're living in poor homes, they're not educated, and we have a deficit model. We've sort of come around to a place in healthcare where we sort of understand that there are poor, sick Indians, but that's not where the story ends. If you live with all of that history, and you know that the policy and legislations of the country that you live in continue to other you, you live in a chronic stress response, which means you have an inflammatory response all the time. So is it any wonder that there's higher rates of diabetes, autoimmune disease, cancer in Indigenous people? Because it's not a level playing field. They're not starting from the same place. And then what often doesn't get talked about is people say, well, you didn't go to residential school. Why does it bother you? Well, I'll tell you the story of my family. So in my recent history, there's nobody who's went to residential school. But we're affected by it. So when I was growing up, my mother lived in Niagara Falls, New York, most of her life, and then she moved to the reserve. And my dad had lived on the reserve all his life. But my mom always told me, don't be involved with that Indigenous health stuff, but just stay away from it. When I went back to school, it's just trouble. You don't want to be involved with it. And I kept thinking, why would she say that to me? Well, my mentor, Pat Mandy, had a similar experience in her family. And so we sat and talked about it one day. That was how my grandparents protected them. They were fair. They lived in town. Don't tell nobody you're an Indian, and you won't have to go to residential school. My grandfather adopted my dad. He already had 12 children, and it was a risk because if you had a lot of kids, your kids were even more at risk of going to residential school. So my grandfather worked, or this would have been my great-grandfather, he worked a full-time job during the day and ran 2 farms. And the reason he did that is because he had enough work on the farm to support all of his kids plus my dad. He did that to protect them. So even those folks who didn't go to residential school were impacted by residential school. And then there's the guilt of the people who didn't go. Why didn't I have to go? Why did my neighbor have to go? Why did my sister have to go and I didn't have to go? And all of that gets passed down. We know it as a nation. It's talked about in our community. It's talked about in our families. And it has caused individual level distress. Broken our families. People have lost parenting skills. And people live in a chronic state of stress. So what do we do about this? How do we put it all together? Well, I like to use Maslow's hierarchy of needs because most people know this and they know it pretty well. How does all of those Indigenous social determinants of health fit with something like this? Well, the esteem needs correlate with the distal determinants of health because that's where our cultural and familial connections are and our self-determination. The intermediate determinants of health, where there's systemic racism and cultural continuity, that makes us the other. So do we really belong? Do we belong everywhere? And do we feel safe where we are? No, we don't. Because of the legacy of abuse, the legacy of everything that's happened, we don't feel safe and we don't feel like we belong. And there are some folks who are overtly racist, and then there are systems that are covertly racist. And there's a lack of cultural safety in the system. Now, everybody doesn't have to know everything about Indigenous people or any culture, which have been willing to learn and open. Because we don't even know about our own stereotypes and biases. And I'll use myself as an example again. Somebody told me recently, maybe a couple of years ago, that there were Syrian refugees settled in Caledonia. My first thought was, what do you mean they put people from another country on an active land claim? So we're still fighting over that piece of land, and you're putting more people on. That was my first thought. And then I had to check myself, because that was my own bias and my own stereotype. And I had to learn about Syrian refugees and why they were there. And I was privileged to be involved in the palliative care for one of them. And I learned a great deal from that, but I had to check myself. And then we get down to the proximal determinants of health, and we understand that those are just the necessities of life. And if we deal with all of those pieces, then people are gonna get their cervix screened. Because how would you go and get your cervix screened for cancer if your kids have rashes from the water that they have to use, and when you go to the doctors, nobody pays attention to you anyways, and you don't have enough money to feed your kids that week? Why is your cervix going to be important? It's just not. It's lower on the list of priorities than just getting through day-to-day life. So back to the case. If we look at that case through a two-eyed seeing approach, then we think about, well, what's going on here? And this is exactly what I did that night. I thought, what's going on here? Well, first of all, she's reliving trauma from a residential school experience. Second of all, do our policies really say that there's only supposed to be 1 or 2 people and all of that? I didn't even know. And neither did the nurses. We were just sort of tossing around policies that we didn't really know what they said. Same with the restraint policy. And this family had no trust in the system anyways to begin with. And then there was the perception of staff that Leona must have been consuming alcohol. She's been reserved, right? She must have been. And we do that unconsciously. We do it always. We do it with homeless people. We do it with the frequent flyers in the ER. You get tired, you get frustrated, you're like, oh my God, here they come again. And that's entrenched. We don't even realize it. So let's stop talking about the poor sick Indian and let's say, what can we do together to make things better? So if we look at this side, this is how we've been typically viewed in the past. We need to address their poverty, their suicide, their alcohol abuse, and their foster care. And we're going to bring in the experts to tell us how to do it. And then we're going to intervene in their families, and we're going to fix all the problems. That hasn't worked. So let's try a new approach. Why don't we build on the strengths of them feeling pride in their culture and the social connections that they have and their worldviews around health and wellness and the resilience that has allowed them to survive until now. Let's stop thinking that we can fix the problem for other people. We need to engage family and communities because they have the answers. We can't do it on our own. If we could do it on our own, we would have already done it. And then take a focus on relationships, equity, well-being, giving people back the right to decide for themselves. So how does this apply to you? Well, there's 3 steps in an Indigenous model of building resilience because this does take resilience to do this. And this organization is going to have to be resilient to build the relationship with Indigenous people because they're hurt. And it's hard when you're constantly sort of butting up against the wall and you're wondering if you're ever going to get through that wall. So we have to all be resilient. So we're going to do it through reconciliation. And I'm so thankful that you came today because the first part of reconciliation is hearing the truth. And I didn't tell you any of that stuff to point a finger because it's not a blame game. It's like Remembrance Day. We all need to know it so it never happens again. And then we need to think about how we view things. It's not wrong to view health the way that you do it. It's not wrong for you to have the thoughts that you do. But there is value in knowing other ways and understanding those other ways, particularly if you're working with that patient population. And to do this, you have to really reflect. You have to think about this. And we're so busy oftentimes we don't think about ourselves anymore. But you have to think about what you value, what you believe, what medicine means to you. What is evidence to you? You have to think about all those things before you can start thinking about what other people think. And what's self-determination? Now, some people read this and they feel like, that's kind of in-your-face political statement. It's not. This is from the Chiefs of Ontario. And all they're saying here is, this is who we've always been, this is who we are today, this is who we'll always be. We are the Anishinaabe, the Mishkegawak, the Ambohoe, and the Lenape peoples, sovereign nations of Turtle Island. Despite all of what we've been taught about federal policy and legislation, this is who we've always said we were. This is still who we are. We're smart, we're intelligent, we have ways of knowing and being that are valuable. And we can do this. And we want to do it with you, not against you. And then when you think about cultural competence, it's never just a one-off. You have to have knowledge, but you also have to self-examine yourself because it's in the attitudes as well. And when you have knowledge and you've adjusted your attitude, then it becomes a skill. And when individuals can do that, we change a system. So I really encourage you to read a newspaper. You know, listen to that news bite on the news that normally you would have just changed the channel because I don't know anything about Indigenous people. Be curious, find out who we are, and move forward. If you're working with a Muslim population, same thing. Be curious about who they are, what they do, what their life is like, and then go looking for it. And remember trauma-informed practice. And if you don't know this, you should know this. Because when I read that, I thought, you know, that's not just Indigenous people, that's our frequent flyers. You know, people just get tired of the behaviors. Because we stop thinking about what's behind the behaviors. We stop targeting that. And we really need to start reframing for ourselves why people are coming here and behaving the way that they do. Because maybe it's not just that they're a flawed person. Maybe they've had something happen in the past and they just don't know how to cope with it or to reach out for help. And it comes out as negative behaviors. And then think about when you're building systems, when you're building processes, who's going to use that process? So I use this example of palliative care because when I talk to the Canadian Society of Palliative Care Physicians, this is what I get, this model here. Okay, so you know these patients can be here and then they can come up and see a specialist and then they go back and then that system is not designed for a patient, that's designed for healthcare professionals. That is the palliative care system designed by Six Nations. Looks nothing like this. So we have to think about what we're designing. We ask patients sometimes to do and to know more than is necessary. We make it so convoluted because we're actually building the system and the process for us, not for them. So we have to think about that. And then have a reciprocal relationship. It's not easy. We are all pressed for time. There are times, sometimes I'll go in and talk to an older person, and I know I have a million other things to do. And then I start their story when they were 5 years old, and I'm like, but you're 95, I don't have 90 years. But I suck it up and I listen, because somewhere in that story is something I need to know. And they need to tell it to me. And we think that we do really good informed consent, we don't. Because how many times when we do informed consent do we really talk about the patient's values and preferences or know anything about them? We don't. I've done it myself. I'm guilty. When I'm pointing a finger, I'm pointing it right back at me. And we have to get over this idea that our system is the only system to use. Because our people are using traditional medicine. And I'll give you an example. There was a gentleman in here who was in here for like 2 weeks with anasarca. And they kept like loading him with all the diuretics they could, and they would get somewhere and then they'd go back, and get somewhere and go back. So then I just happened to come on the hospitalist team, and I got him. And I realized he's from the reserve, so I sat down and I talked to him. And at the end of the conversation, I said, and do you use any traditional medicine? I ask it just like any other medication, you know, aspirin, Tylenol, traditional medicine. He said, yeah, I do. And he opened up his locker, and there's this giant jug of water. And I said, well, how much of that do you drink a day? And he told me, well, his 2-liter fluid restriction wasn't working because he was probably drinking about 4 liters a day. So I asked his sister, who was bringing his medicine in, can you talk to his practitioner and tell her what's going on? And is there a way to reduce the volume of liquid? She did. We diuresed him. He went home. But he sat here for 2 weeks, just going around in circles because nobody talked to him. So when we're entering into relationships, this is direct feedback from my patients. Listen more often than you speak, and share humor. Realize that quality of life exists in the presence of disease, and recognize what an honor it is for you as a healthcare professional to be part of somebody's journey in life. It doesn't feel like it when it's like, you know, the end of your 12-hour shift and you're dead and you've had a bad day. But it is an honor. Think about the things that we get to see and do that nobody else gets to see and do. It's an honor. And then stop building systems and organizations that just put up walls from families and communities. And stop telling us what to do. Talk to us. Let's make a plan together. I'm not going to go through these, but I've put a ton of resources in here for anybody that wants to. The LIN held a community engagement session in 2017. The report says what Indigenous people want in the healthcare system. It's there for you to look at. These are all the Indigenous organizations in the LIN. If you need a resource or you have a question, call them. They'll point you in the right direction. Six Nations and all the services that they offer. Mississaugas of the Credit and their services. There's a link there to them as well. In January, our cancer navigator should be back. This woman is invaluable for the cancer navigation process. So if you have an inpatient person, please hook her up because she'll make things easier for all of us. We do have an Indigenous patient navigator here. Unfortunately, she's only here a little bit of the time. But if you can get a hold of her, she will make your life so much easier, and she will also help you discharge. And if you want more training, you can sign yourself up. These are free webinars that you can listen to and podcasts whenever you want to. This is free CME online modules. And to end the case, what did we do for this lady? Well, we removed all her restraints, and her kid sat there with her so that there was a kid at both arms so that she wouldn't be pulling her lines out. She wouldn't be doing things to hurt herself. They spoke to her in their native language, soft, soothing, and that calmed her. And she had pain, and we weren't treating her pain. So we treated her pain, and the delirium slowly settled. Then I had to go out to the nurses because they were distressed, and they weren't being bad nurses. They just didn't know what was going on. So I told them why all those 10 people were in there, because they were all her children, all 10 of them. And there was no POA. So they had no idea how to handle this situation. They just needed someone to guide them. Talked about the abuse in residential schools, so they had an understanding of why everybody was so upset in that room, and why they didn't trust the system. Then I went back to the family and talked to them about what regulations are on the healthcare team, that they can't do whatever they want, they have to do what they need to do. Encourage them to stay and engage, and they did, and they had a good relationship with that nursing team when they left this hospital. And because the Substitute Decision Making Act does not coincide with our worldview, I just suggested to them, you need a spokesperson. Everybody can have a say, but you need a spokesperson. Then, after that, I went to the Law Commission and I said, this doesn't work. So they've engaged in a provincial process where they've went to many communities and they've got feedback, and they're going to make some recommendations around changing that substitute decision-making framework. And then I actually looked at the policies, which I should have done before. So the take-home message is that we all have to know the truth to reconcile this relationship. And the social-political history is not just history. It's still impacting people on an individual level today. But if we try to take a two-eyed team approach, we acknowledge that both are important and both are valued in healthcare. And I just want to leave you with this. This is a quote by a chief who's now died. But one of the other things that symbolized relationship in our community was silver, because it's sturdy and it doesn't break and it doesn't rust, but it does tarnish. So just like relationships, if you think of silver like a relationship, you have to go and you have to keep polishing it. You can't do just one thing here and there and expect the relationship to be good. You have to pay attention to it. And that's it.